The shovel slipped from his trembling hands. Elias Boone staggered back as the earth beneath his boots began to sink, a low groan rising from the hole like something alive. The lantern he'd wedged on a stump flickered wildly, casting broken shadows over the pit he'd spent half the night digging. From below came a breath, a sound soft as wind, but it wasn't wind. His old heart pounded hard enough to blur his sight, and in the dim light behind him, his horse, Willow, stamped the ground and let out a warning cry that sliced through the mountain silence. Whatever lay beneath that soil had been waiting a long, long time to be found. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. 2 days earlier, the mountain had been still and quiet, the kind of quiet that seeps into your bones. Elias Boone, a man carved by 60 winters, stood outside his cabin with a steaming cup of black coffee, watching the fog drift like ghosts through the pine trees. His place sat high above the valley, tucked where the ridge split and a creek whispered its way down to the town below. It had been a lonely life since his wife Ruth passed on. The woods kept him company now, along with his animals, chickens, 2 goats, and most of all, Willow. She'd come into his life the previous winter, a walking skeleton of a mare he'd found collapsed in the snow near the timberline. Folks said a wild horse that far up the mountain was bad luck, but Elias had never been one to listen to talk. He nursed her back from the edge with warm mash and patience, talking to her as though she were human. By spring, Willow had regained her strength, her coat gleaming a deep chestnut in the morning sun. She followed him everywhere, steady as his own shadow. That morning, as the fog thinned, Elias led her toward the old trough near the well. The trough had been there since his father's time, made from thick pine boards and iron nails. The water inside was fresh from the spring that ran beneath the cabin, cold, clean, and sweet. But Willow balked. She stopped dead. Her muscles tense beneath her skin. Her ears flattened, and a low tremor ran through her frame. Elias frowned, tugging gently at the lead rope. "Come on now, girl," he murmured. "Ain't nothing there but water." Willow didn't move, her dark eyes fixed on the trough, unblinking. Then, with a sharp snort, she backed away so hard the rope burned against his palm. Elias stared. He'd seen horses spook at thunder, at snakes, at the smell of bears, but not at a still pool of water. The air hung heavy, filled with the droning of cicadas and the distant caw of a crow. He crouched beside the trough, scooping a handful of water to his lips. Cool, tasted fine. He even ran his hand along the wood, checking for loose nails or a snake hiding in the shade. Nothing. When he turned back, Willow stood her ground, nostrils flaring, eyes wide and glinting with fear. It wasn't like her. "Suit yourself," Elias muttered. He fetched a bucket, filled it from the same well, and offered it to her. Willow hesitated for a heartbeat, then drank eagerly, draining it dry. That unsettled him more than anything else. She wasn't afraid of the water. She was afraid of that place. As the day wore on, Elias couldn't shake the feeling. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of rain and old wood. Each time he passed by the trough, he caught himself glancing at it, half expecting something to move beneath the surface. By evening, the sky had bruised purple, and clouds rolled low over the ridge. Elias sat on the porch, sharpening his axe while Willow grazed near the fence line. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone echoed in the gathering dark. He told himself it was foolishness, just an old man's imagination running wild. But then Willow lifted her head, ears pricked toward the well. Her muscles stiffened, and she let out a deep, uneasy sound, half nicker, half warning. Elias froze. From somewhere near the trough came a faint creak, like wood shifting under weight. The sound was gone as quickly as it came. The night settled back into silence, yet his skin prickled as if the mountain itself were watching. He stayed awake longer than he meant to, listening to the rain begin to fall. Somewhere between the hiss of water on the roof and the low roll of thunder, he heard it again, a hollow thump beneath the earth, dull and distant, like a heartbeat muffled by soil. The next morning dawned gray and heavy. Mist clung to the trees. Elias brewed his coffee, but it tasted of metal, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He went to check on Willow, who stood at the edge of the corral, her head turned toward the trough once more. She hadn't touched her hay. "Still worried about that spot, huh?" he said softly. The mare blinked, and he could have sworn there was something almost human in her eyes, pleading, warning. He walked to the trough and ran his hand across the boards again. The wood felt colder than it should have, damp though it hadn't rained in hours. For a long while he just stood there, staring at it, the air around him thick with unease. That's when he made up his mind. Elias Boone was not a man easily rattled. He'd survived blizzards, bear attacks, and 2 wars. But something about that ground beneath the trough stirred an instinct older than logic, a whisper in the back of his mind that said, "Dig." He fetched his shovel from the shed and jammed it into the earth beside the trough. The soil was dense and stubborn, as if it didn't want to give. He worked slow, careful, each thrust of the shovel echoing like a heartbeat in the fog. Willow stood a few yards away, unmoving, her breath visible in the chill air. By noon, the first layer of soil had given way to darker earth beneath, rich, compacted, unnaturally so. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Something wasn't right. He leaned on the shovel, staring at the ground as though it might speak to him. In the stillness, a crow cried from somewhere up the ridge. The sound carried down through the valley like a warning. He looked toward Willow. The mare hadn't taken her eyes off him. Her muscles quivered, her tail flicking nervously. "All right, girl," he said, his voice low. "We'll see what's got you so scared." He drove the shovel in deeper. The metal struck something solid, a dull thud that didn't sound like stone. He knelt, brushing away the dirt with his calloused hands. Beneath the soil, just visible, was the edge of old, rotted wood. He sat back on his heels, the cold air catching in his lungs. The wind picked up, hissing through the pines. Whatever lay beneath his feet had been buried a long time, and the mountain was done keeping it secret. The first light of morning crept across the ridge, spilling a pale glow over the mist-shrouded valley. Elias Boone sat on his porch, boots muddy, the shovel still leaning against the wall beside him. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hole, the edge of old wood half buried beneath the soil, and the way Willow had stood frozen in the fog, her body trembling with a fear he could almost feel in his own bones. The mountain was quiet now, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to keep their distance from the clearing where the trough once stood. Elias rubbed a hand across his tired face, his joints aching from the digging, but his mind restless. Whatever he had uncovered down there didn't just belong to the mountain. It belonged to someone who had wanted it hidden for a long time. A soft sound broke the silence, hooves crunching on gravel. Willow was pacing the corral, her head turned toward the hole, ears flat, nostrils flaring. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. When Elias approached, she nickered low, uneasy but trusting. He stroked her neck gently. "It's all right, girl," he murmured. "We'll find out what's troubling you soon enough." He walked to the hole, crouched beside it, and touched the wood he'd uncovered. It was rough beneath his fingers, splintered and soft from age. He pressed down lightly, and the board shifted, groaning faintly as though exhaling after years of silence. A faint, damp odor rose from the earth, something like old roots and time itself. Elias drew his hand back quickly. He knew the smell of death and decay from his days working in the forest. But this was different. It wasn't rot. It was memory. Before he could decide what to do next, the sound of an engine drifted up the mountain road. Elias turned, squinting through the morning haze. A faded blue pickup truck crawled up the hill, its tires crunching on the gravel path. He recognized it instantly. Clara Mays. She was one of the few people who still visited him up here, bringing coffee, flour, and news from the town below. A sturdy woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and the kind of sharp intuition that came from years of mountain living. Clara climbed out of the truck, brushing dust from her skirt. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Elias," she said, taking one look at his face. "Or dug one up." Elias gave a tired chuckle. Maybe a bit of both. He told her about Willow, about the trough, about how the mare refused to drink. He didn't mention the unease creeping up his spine or the strange heaviness in the air, but Clara saw it anyway. She always did. "That old well's been there longer than you've been alive," she said, her gaze shifting toward the clearing. "Back before your father bought this land, it belonged to the Pike family. You remember the stories?" Elias frowned. "I remember the name. Silas Pike, wasn't it? Mean as a snake, if folks are to be believed." "Meaner," Clara replied softly. "He ruled this ridge with fear back in the day. Took land from families, drove folks off when they couldn't pay him. Then one winter, he just vanished. People said he had gold hidden somewhere on this mountain. Others said the land took him back for what he did." She looked toward the hole, her expression tightening. "Maybe Willow feels what we can't." Elias didn't answer. The wind picked up, sweeping through the pines, carrying a low hum that made both of them turn toward the trees. It was only the sound of branches creaking, but it felt like the mountain was whispering, listening. "You be careful with that ground," Clara warned, her voice low. "Some things are buried for a reason." After she left, the mountain seemed to close in again. Elias went about his chores, chopping wood, mending the fence, pretending life hadn't shifted. But the thought of that buried wood tugged at him like a splinter under skin. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, heavy and dark. Thunder muttered somewhere beyond the ridge. Willow paced the corral, restless. Elias tried to calm her, but her muscles rippled with tension. That night, the storm came down in earnest. Rain hammered the tin roof, and lightning lit the cabin in sharp flashes. Elias sat in his chair, rifle resting across his knees, staring out the window toward the trough's old spot. Each flash of light illuminated the clearing, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a shadow shifting near the pit. He told himself it was his imagination, but the feeling in his gut said otherwise. He stood, threw on his coat, and stepped out into the downpour. Mud sucked at his boots as he crossed the yard. The rain stung his face, cold and sharp, but he barely felt it. He reached the hole and knelt beside it, lantern in hand. The beam flickered in the wind, catching on the glistening boards below. The ground around the pit had softened, the edges sagging under the weight of the storm. Then, through the roar of rain, came a faint sound. 3 dull knocks from below. Elias froze. His breath caught. For a heartbeat, everything else vanished. The rain, the wind, the thunder. Only that sound remained, deep and hollow. "Is someone there?" he called out, voice rough, absurd even as he said it. No answer came, only the hiss of rain. He was about to step back when Willow screamed from the corral, a high, piercing cry that cut through the storm. She reared, hooves flashing, eyes wide with panic. Elias stumbled to his feet, lantern swinging wildly, and ran to her. She was wild with fear, striking at the fence, snorting, trying to break free. "Easy, girl!" he shouted, grabbing the rope and pulling her close. But her gaze stayed fixed on the clearing, on the hole, as if something unseen had crawled up from it. When the storm finally eased near dawn, both man and horse were drenched and trembling. Elias led Willow into the barn, rubbed her down, and stayed there until the first light seeped through the cracks in the boards. He looked toward the clearing again. The pit was half filled with water now, murky and still. Yet even from here, he could swear he saw tiny ripples disturb the surface, as if something beneath was moving, slow and deliberate. Exhaustion pulled at him, but he couldn't walk away. He went back to the hole, shovel in hand, and began clearing the softened mud. The wood beneath was slick now, but the edges were clearer. He brushed away the muck, revealing the faint outline of iron bands running across the boards. It wasn't just a piece of timber, it was a lid. He sat back hard, the realization settling cold in his chest. Someone had built this. Someone had meant for it to stay hidden. Elias stared down at it for a long time, the air thick with silence. Willow stood near the fence, still watching. Her sides rose and fell in steady rhythm, but her eyes never left him. He ran a hand through his wet hair, muttering under his breath. "All right then. We'll find out what you've been guarding, girl." He turned toward the cabin, every step heavy with purpose. Tomorrow, when the ground dried, he'd move the rest of the boards and dig deeper. As he reached the porch, he glanced back one last time. A faint breeze stirred the leaves, and for a brief second, he could have sworn he heard a voice carried on it, a whisper, low and broken. "Don't dig." The word dissolved into the wind, gone before he could be sure it was ever there. Elias stood still, the shovel slick in his grasp, the dawn light stretching long across the mountain. He didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But he knew when the land was trying to speak, and this land was screaming for him to listen. The morning after the storm broke clean and cold. Mist curled off the ridge like smoke from a dying fire, and the ground gleamed wet beneath the sun's thin light. Elias Boone stepped out of his cabin, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He could smell pine and mud and something else. Something faint, metallic, like the scent of a nail long buried. The hole near the old trough was half filled with rainwater now. The reflection of the sky shimmered on its surface, disturbed by small bubbles that rose lazily to the top. Elias crouched beside it, the handle of his shovel cool in his hands. He felt Willow's eyes on him from across the corral. The mare stood rigid, her ears angled forward, tail flicking in sharp, uneasy motions. "All right, girl," he muttered, voice low. "Let's see what kind of secrets you've been guarding." He dug. The earth gave easily after the rain, and soon the water darkened with mud as his shovel struck the boards again. This time he didn't stop. He cleared away more soil, exposing a larger surface, old timber banded with rusted iron, edges warped but solid. It wasn't just a random piece of wood. It was a lid. Elias leaned close, running his fingers over the rough grain. The smell was stronger now, a mix of damp soil and something old, like musty paper and rot. He took a step back, heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. Someone had built it. Someone had buried it. The thought of Clara May's words returned to him. Some things are buried for a reason. Still, curiosity pushed harder than fear. He fetched his crowbar from the shed and returned to the pit. The first strike against the wood made a dull, hollow sound that echoed faintly beneath the ground. He hesitated, staring at the dark outline where the iron bands cut across the boards. Then he struck again. The board cracked. A puff of stale air escaped, thick and heavy, smelling of age and secrets. Elias coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. Willow whinnied sharply behind him, hooves striking the ground in protest. "Easy," he called over his shoulder. "It's just air, not ghosts." But the words didn't ease his nerves. He pried the boards apart, piece by piece, until a gap wide enough appeared. Beneath it yawned darkness, a shallow pit reinforced by old timbers. He lowered the lantern, the flame trembling in the draft. The light revealed the rough outline of a small chamber no deeper than 5 feet. The dirt walls were packed tight, and in one corner, half buried in clay, was a chest. Elias froze. The chest was made of wood and iron, bound with heavy chains now streaked red with rust. His throat went dry. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. He lowered himself slowly into the pit, boots sinking into the wet soil. Every movement echoed faintly, as though the mountain itself were listening. When his feet touched the ground, the air grew colder, heavier. He crouched beside the chest, brushing mud away with his hands. The lid was carved with shallow grooves, almost symbols, worn smooth by time. He tried the latch, but it didn't move. He could hear the faint rattle of metal inside the chains. Whatever was in there hadn't seen daylight in decades. He pressed his hand against the top, feeling the weight of history beneath his palm. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he sighed, stepped back, and climbed out. His knees creaked, his breath shallow. He sat on the edge of the pit, staring down at what he'd found. He didn't know what frightened him more, the idea that he'd uncovered something terrible, or the thought that he was now part of it. Willow snorted, breaking his thoughts. Elias looked at her and saw that her fear had changed. She no longer trembled. Instead, she stood still, alert, as if waiting for what came next. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I reckon we've come too far to stop now." He wiped his hands on his jeans and fetched a hammer and chisel from the shed. As he worked at the chains, he thought of his father, who used to tell him that mountains hold memories the way rivers hold stones. Some things get buried deep, worn smooth by time, but never gone. The chains gave a groan as one of the links snapped. He froze again. The sound was so human, so pained, that it set every hair on his neck on edge. Before he could move, a voice called from behind him. "Elias Boone, you diggin' for treasure or trouble?" He turned fast, shovel raised, only to see Sheriff Dale Harlow approaching up the trail on horseback. The older man dismounted with a grunt, rain slicker flapping in the wind. His gray mustache twitched when he smiled. "Clara stopped by the station this morning," Harlow said. "Told me you've been up here digging where the old pike well used to be. Figured I'd better come take a look before you fall through the mountain." Elias exhaled slowly, lowering the shovel. "Guess news travels fast, even up here. Faster when it smells like trouble." The sheriff walked to the edge of the pit and looked down. His expression changed when he saw the chest. "Good Lord, you found something." "Looks like it," Elias said. "Don't know what yet." Harlow crouched beside the hole, his eyes narrowing. "You know whose land this was before your family's?" Elias nodded. "Silas Pike. Clara told me." "Then you know the stories. Folks said Pike wasn't just a crook. He was a damn tyrant. Drove people off their farms, took their stock, their homes, disappeared one winter, and no one cried when he did." "Think this might be his doing?" Elias asked. Harlow's jaw tightened. "If there's a chest down there, I'd wager it's full of the kind of things a man like that would rather the world forgot." Elias studied the older man's face, saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. "You want me to stop digging?" Harlow hesitated. "I want you to be careful. You stir up ghosts. They don't always go back to sleep easy." He sighed, straightened, and tipped his hat. "If you find anything worth knowing, bring it down to me. Don't keep it up here." When the sheriff rode off, the valley swallowed the sound of his horse's hooves. The air settled again, heavy and waiting. Elias looked back into the pit. The chest sat half-buried, a dark promise against the earth. He didn't move for a long while. Then he set his lantern down beside him and leaned forward. The last chain was brittle. It snapped beneath the pressure of his chisel. The lid shifted slightly, just enough for a breath of air to escape, a whisper from another time. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he sat back, breathing hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind him, Willow stamped once, then fell still. The mountain wind rustled through the pines, carrying with it the faintest echo, like distant voices, too soft to understand, but full of sorrow. Elias raised his eyes to the ridgeline, where the sunlight faded into the first blush of dusk. He felt it then, a presence not of ghosts but of memory, of the land itself watching. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would open the chest. For now, he covered the pit with a tarp, weighted it down with stones, and turned back toward the cabin. The light was fading fast. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the clearing, reaching toward the place where he dug. And as he closed the door behind him, he could have sworn he heard it again. 3 faint knocks, muffled by earth. A warning or an invitation. Either way, the mountain had spoken. "And come morning," Elias Boone would answer. The next morning broke slow and pale, the kind of dawn that carried a chill even the fire couldn't drive away. Elias Boone sat at his kitchen table with a half-empty cup of coffee, staring through the fogged window toward the clearing. The tarp he'd thrown over the pit glistened with dew, unmoving, like a scar on the earth. He hadn't slept. Every time his eyes closed, he dreamed of knocks, 3 soft thuds from beneath the ground, and woke with the taste of iron on his tongue. Willow had been restless too, pacing the corral, nickering low through the night. Now she stood still, staring toward the same spot as if she expected it to move. Elias rubbed his temples, trying to push the fog from his mind. He wasn't a man who frightened easily, but something about this, about the way the air seemed to hum when he stood near that pit, made his blood run cold. By mid-morning, he'd made up his mind. He wasn't going to let fear or old stories stop him. Whatever was buried down there had waited long enough. He gathered his tools, lantern, rope, crowbar, and walked into the clearing. The earth was still damp, soft beneath his boots. He pulled back the tarp, revealing the dark hole below. The air that rose from it was colder than the mountain morning, carrying a smell of rust and damp wood. Willow whinnied behind him, stamping hard. "It's all right, girl," he said quietly, though his voice trembled. "We'll get this done, then we can both sleep easy." He set the lantern at the edge, grabbed the rope, and lowered himself into the pit once more. The earth walls closed around him, and for a moment he felt as though he were stepping into another world, a forgotten cellar beneath the mountain's skin. The chest waited where he'd left it, its iron bands dull in the lamplight. He crouched beside it, running his hand along the lid. The last of the chains lay broken, the links cold as bone. "All right," he murmured. "Let's see what secrets you've been keeping." The lid resisted at first, but with a groan and a sharp twist of the crowbar, it gave way. A gust of stale air rushed out, thick enough to make his eyes water. He leaned back, coughing, then lifted the lantern higher. Inside lay a bundle of old documents, books, leather-bound ledgers, and a few loose sheets sealed in wax. The edges were yellowed and curling, but still intact. Nestled among them was something small and glinting, a pocket watch, its face cracked, but the initials SP still etched clear on the back. "Silas Pike," Elias whispered. He lifted one of the ledgers carefully. The cover nearly disintegrated at his touch, but the writing inside was legible. Names, numbers, deeds, and signatures. His brow furrowed as he turned the pages. These were records of land transfers, debts, and payments, all signed under Pike's name, but beside each were small notes in a second hand. Those notes chilled him, threatened refusal, remove before spring, burn evidence if family returns. Elias exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a man's journal. It was proof of theft, intimidation, and ruin. Clara's stories had been true. Pike had stolen from half the valley. At the bottom of the chest lay a smaller box, metal, its lock long rusted through. Elias pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a strip of oilcloth, was a revolver, and beneath it, a folded letter sealed in black wax. He hesitated before breaking the seal. The paper crumbled slightly in his hands. The ink faded but still readable. "To whoever finds this, may you know that my hands are stained with more than dirt. The land I took was not mine, and the souls I drove off haunt my sleep. If there is justice beyond this earth, I pray it finds me. But if not, may the mountain do what men could not. Forgive me, Ruth. Tell our boy to stay far from this place. S.P." Elias stared at the letter until his eyes blurred. A confession, buried and forgotten. He leaned back, his breath fogging the lantern light. The mountain had kept this secret for decades, but now it had chosen to give it up, and to him, of all people. A crack of thunder rolled in the distance, though the sky above was still pale blue. He glanced up toward the ridge, uneasy. The air felt strange again, charged, humming, as if the mountain itself was awake. Then, from behind him, came the sound of footsteps. Elias turned sharply, heart leaping. A figure stood at the edge of the pit, broad-shouldered, wearing a brown coat and wide-brimmed hat. "Elias Boone!" the man called, voice low and rough. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Elias squinted against the light. He recognized the voice instantly. "Harold Pike," he said. "Didn't expect to see you on this side of the mountain." Harold stepped closer, boots sinking into the wet ground. His face was weathered, hard, but the resemblance to the name on the letter was clear. Same jawline, same pale eyes. "My family's name has been tied to this land for generations," Harold said, "and what's buried here ain't yours to dig up." Elias straightened slowly, gripping the crowbar. "That chest don't belong to you, either." It's proof of what your kin did. The folks he ruined deserve to be remembered. You think I don't know what my great-grandfather did? Harold's voice rose, anger sharp and raw. He was a bastard, but he built this land with his blood. And I'll be damned if I let you or anyone else tear his name through the dirt. He stepped closer, eyes flashing. Cover it back up, Boone. Let it lie. Elias didn't move. I can't do that. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. A crow cried somewhere far off, the sound echoing through the trees. Harold's hand dropped to the pistol at his belt. Then you're giving me no choice. Before Elias could speak, Willow screamed from the corral, a sound so fierce it shattered the stillness. The mare reared, kicking at the fence, eyes blazing. The distraction was enough. Elias seized the moment, swinging the lantern upward. The sudden flare of light startled Harold, who stumbled back, his boot slipping on the mud. Elias climbed out of the pit, crowbar raised, breath heaving. You want to fight for your granddaddy's lies? Then you better be ready to bury yourself with them. Harold steadied himself, fury twisting his face. You don't know what you've unleashed, old man, he spat. That chest was buried for a reason. My family made sure of it. Lightning split the sky then, striking somewhere near the ridge. The ground trembled faintly under their feet, and both men looked toward the trees as a deep rumble rolled through the earth. Elias turned back toward Harold, but the man was already backing away, fear flickering in his eyes now. You'll regret this, he said, before retreating down the trail and disappearing into the mist. Elias stood there for a long time, chest heaving, the storm's echo fading into silence. He turned toward the pit, where the chest still lay open, its contents glinting faintly in the weak light. He knew now that this was no ordinary discovery. It was a wound in the land, reopened after too many years. As he covered the chest with the tarp once more, he looked toward the horizon. Tomorrow he would bring the letter and ledgers to Sheriff Harlow. The truth had to come out, no matter what ghosts it stirred. Behind him, Willow had calmed, her breathing steady again. She lowered her head toward the trough and for the first time in days took a long, deep drink. Elias watched her in silence. The mountain was still again, but he could feel it. Beneath the calm, something was shifting, awakening. And deep inside, he knew this wasn't over. Tomorrow would bring reckoning. The next morning arrived heavy with fog, the kind that made the ridge disappear into a blur of white. Elias Boone woke before dawn, his chest tight, sleep still clinging to him like a damp blanket. The memory of Harold Pike's warning echoed through his head. You don't know what you've unleashed. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his face with calloused hands. The house felt colder than usual, as if the mountain's chill had seeped through the very walls. From outside came the soft clink of metal, Willow shifting in her pen, her bit rattling gently. That small, familiar sound steadied him. Elias moved slow that morning, brewing coffee thick enough to chew, watching the sun try and fail to pierce the fog. He decided what he had to do. The letter and ledgers needed to go to Sheriff Harlow. Secrets like that had already ruined too many lives. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing the path that led down the mountain toward town. He wrapped the documents carefully in oilcloth, tied them tight, and placed them inside his saddlebag. As he stepped out onto the porch, Willow nickered softly, her breath steaming in the cold air. "Morning, girl," he said, patting her neck. "We've got work to do." But before he could mount, a sound stopped him. A distant engine grinding up the rocky path. It grew louder, closer. Elias squinted toward the bend in the road, just as a dark green truck emerged through the mist. Dust and gravel kicked up behind it. The truck came to a halt a few yards from the cabin. Harold Pike stepped out. He wasn't alone. Two younger men climbed out after him, both broad-shouldered, both with the kind of hard eyes that didn't belong to honest work. One carried a rifle. Elias's stomach turned cold. "Harold," he called, voice steady though his pulse quickened. "You come back to finish what you started?" Harold gave a thin smile. "I came to clean up what you stirred up, Boone. Word travels fast, and I can't have my family's name dragged through the mud by some old hermit with a shovel." Elias straightened, his hand resting on Willow's reins. "That chest down there isn't about your name. It's about the people your great-granddaddy cheated out of their lives." "You don't understand," Harold said, his voice sharp, desperate. "If those papers reach the sheriff, I lose everything. Land, reputation, maybe even prison. I can't let that happen." The man with the rifle shifted slightly, his thumb brushing the safety. Elias's jaw tightened. "Then you best shoot me now, because I ain't handing over the truth." Harold's face twisted, anger and fear warring inside him. For a moment, the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the tree line, a new sound broke the tension, the steady clop of hooves. Sheriff Harlow rode into view, his horse snorting clouds of white. "Morning, gentlemen," the sheriff said calmly, reins in one hand, the other resting on the handle of his revolver. "Seems like I picked the right day to pay a visit." Harold stiffened. "You don't know what's going on here, Sheriff." "I reckon I do," Harlow replied, sliding off his horse. "Clara May came by early, said she was worried. Figured I'd check on Boone before breakfast." His eyes swept from Elias to the two armed men. "Now why don't you boys lower those guns before I get grumpy?" The younger men hesitated, then glanced at Harold. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Harold sighed and motioned for them to step back. Harlow nodded once. "Good. Now somebody tell me what this is about." Elias took a step forward. "Sheriff, I found something buried under my old trough, an old chest full of documents. They prove what Silas Pike did to the families around here. I was fixing to bring it to you this morning." Harlow's expression darkened. "That's so?" Harold's voice cut in. "You can't prove any of it's real. You think folks'll believe some rotten papers over generations of hard work? They'll believe what's written in Pike's own hand," Elias said, pulling the wrapped bundle from his saddlebag. "And this, his confession." He held up the folded letter. Harold's eyes widened. "You shouldn't have read that." He lunged forward, but before he could grab it, Harlow stepped between them, his revolver drawn. "Enough," the sheriff said coldly. "You're done, Harold. You and your boys turn around and head down that mountain before I haul you off myself." Harold froze, chest heaving. For a moment, Elias thought he might fight. Then the fire drained from his eyes, replaced by something else. Defeat, maybe shame. He nodded once to his men. "Let's go." They backed away, climbed into the truck, and rolled back down the road without another word. When the sound of the engine faded, the mountain was quiet again. Only the whisper of the wind moved through the pines. Harlow holstered his revolver, turning toward Elias. "You all right?" Elias nodded slowly. "Yeah, but this ain't over. There's more to that chest than just paper. That man said I'd unleashed something." Harlow frowned. "What do you mean?" Elias told him about the knocks, the cold air, the strange stillness that hung over the clearing. The sheriff listened, his expression unreadable. When Elias finished, Harlow said quietly, "Some say the past don't die easy in these hills. Maybe what you found woke something best left alone. Maybe," Elias said. "But truth don't stay buried forever." They spent the next hour securing the chest and its contents. Harlow wrapped the ledgers and letter in oilskin, tying them to his saddle. "I'll take these into town," he said. "Lock 'em up proper. Once we've got 'em copied, we'll make it public." Elias nodded, though unease still churned in his chest. As the sheriff prepared to leave, Clara May's old truck rattled up the path. She climbed out, her face pale when she saw the hole in the chest. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "You really did find it." Elias nodded, "And near got myself killed for it." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then at Willow, who stood calm now, tail flicking lazily. "That mare of yours, she knew, didn't she?" She knew it was down there. Elias's eyes softened. Maybe she did. Maybe animals hear what we can't. Clara laid a hand on his arm. "Then maybe she saved your life." Harlow mounted his horse. "You two keep close to home," he said. "If Pike or anyone else gives you trouble, you send word." "I'll handle it," Elias nodded. "Appreciate it, Sheriff." When they were gone, Clara and Elias stood side by side, watching the mist lift off the ridge. The sun broke through at last, lighting the valley in gold. For a brief moment, everything looked peaceful. But deep in the pit, beneath the place where the chest had lain, the soil shifted ever so slightly, as if something else waited below, deeper still. Willow lifted her head, ears pricking toward the hole. A shiver rippled down her flank. Elias followed her gaze and frowned. "Guess the mountain ain't done with us yet." He threw the tarp back over the pit and tightened the ropes, but the unease wouldn't leave him. The air felt too still, too heavy, like the moment before a storm. That night, as he sat by the fire, the wind rose outside, moaning through the cracks in the cabin walls. Somewhere in the distance, a sound echoed, a faint, hollow knocking, 3 times, slow and steady. Elias set down his cup, his heart beating hard. Willow neighed from the corral, a frightened, lonely sound that faded into the dark. He stood and reached for his lantern. Whatever the mountain was hiding, it hadn't finished speaking. And by dawn, he would know the rest. The storm came just before dawn. Wind howled down from the ridge, rattling the shutters and shaking the cabin walls. Elias Boone woke to the sound of Willow's frantic whinnying from the corral. Rain lashed against the roof, the kind that came hard and fast, drumming like war. He threw on his coat and stepped outside into the dark, lantern in hand. The mountain was alive with noise, the groan of trees bending, the rush of water down the slope, the heavy thud of something shifting beneath the ground. The tarp over the pit had been ripped loose by the wind, flapping wildly. Mud washed down in rivers, carrying leaves and stones. Willow reared against the fence, eyes wide and white. Elias grabbed her reins, trying to calm her, but the air itself seemed charged, like the whole mountain was trembling. "It's all right, girl," he shouted above the storm. "Easy now." But it wasn't all right. Through the sheets of rain, he saw it. The earth where the chest had lain was collapsing inward, widening into a sinkhole. The ground cracked open, spilling soil and roots. Beneath it yawned darkness, deep and hollow, as if the mountain had opened its mouth. Elias pulled Willow back from the edge just as the ground gave way. A section of the corral fence vanished into the pit with a roar, wood splintering and disappearing into blackness. The noise was deafening, followed by silence, a heavy, waiting silence that seemed to swallow the storm for a heartbeat. Then came the knock. 3 dull thuds, faint but clear, rising up from the hole. Elias froze. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the sound of falling debris. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was answering. Lightning split the sky, lighting the clearing in a flash of white. For that instant, he thought he saw movement below, a shape shifting in the dark, pale and human, reaching upward. He stumbled back, heart pounding, dragging Willow toward the barn. Rain poured off the roof in sheets. When they reached shelter, he shut the doors tight and leaned against them, chest heaving. For a long time he could hear nothing but the storm. Then, slowly, another sound rose through the rain, the rumble of a truck engine. Headlights cut through the gray morning. Clara May's old Ford crawled up the muddy road, slipping and sliding. She jumped out before it even stopped, coat pulled tight around her. "Elias," she called, voice nearly lost to the wind. "Are you all right?" He nodded weakly. "Barely." The pit, it caved in. She looked toward the clearing, eyes wide. "Lord have mercy." I could see the ground moving from halfway down the ridge. It's like the mountains swallowing itself. They stood side by side, watching the rain hammer the earth. The hole was deeper now, a black wound in the land. The chest and all its contents were gone. Clara turned to him. "Maybe it's for the best," she said softly. "Maybe the mountain's putting things back where they belong." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't shake the image of that pale shape reaching up from the dark. He wasn't sure what he'd seen, or if it had been real at all. By mid-morning, the storm began to fade. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the clouds breaking apart to reveal streaks of pale blue. Sheriff Harlow arrived soon after, his horse caked in mud. He dismounted, looking from Elias to the pit. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "It's gone." "Everything," Elias said. "The chest, the papers, the letter, washed away." Harlow scratched his chin. "Doesn't matter. We still got the copies in town. Truth's out now. Folks'll know what Silas Pike did, and Harold won't be able to hide behind that name anymore." Elias nodded, though his gaze stayed fixed on the pit. "You seen Harold?" Harlow's jaw tightened. "Not since yesterday. But I heard his truck turned up at the bottom of Dead Man's Hollow this morning. No sign of him inside Elias's stomach twisted. You think he... I think the mountain's got a long memory," Harlow said quietly. They stood in silence for a while, watching mist rise from the wet earth. The pit no longer looked threatening, just empty, quiet, like a wound beginning to heal. By afternoon, the storm had passed. Clara helped Elias clear debris from the yard, and Harlow rode back toward town. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as though the mountain had exhaled. When the last of the clouds broke, sunlight spilled across the clearing. Steam rose from the wet grass. Willow wandered near the edge of the corral, calm again, tail swishing lazily. She lowered her head to the new trough Elias had built and drank deep, water glinting like glass in the sun. Elias watched her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. For the first time in days, he felt peace. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, he walked to the edge of the pit. It had already begun to fill with rainwater, forming a shallow pond that reflected the fading sky. He stood there a long while, hat in hand. "This land's seen too much buried under it," he said softly. "Too much hurt. Maybe now it can rest." He fetched a flat stone from the creek and carried it to the pit's edge. With careful hands, he placed it in the soil and etched a few words into it with his knife. For the truth that the mountain kept, and the man who dared to uncover it. When he finished, he stepped back, wiping the sweat and rain from his brow. The wind moved through the pines, gentle now, almost kind. He thought of Ruth, his late wife, and wondered if she'd be proud of him. He thought of the people who had lost everything to greed and lies, and how, at last, the mountain had given them back their voice. As twilight settled, he returned to the porch. Willow followed him halfway, then stopped by the pond, her reflection rippling in the water. For a heartbeat, Elias could swear he saw another reflection beside hers, a man's, faint and tired, standing where the chest had been buried. It was gone in an instant, swallowed by the wind. "Rest easy," Elias murmured. "It's over now." He lit the lantern, its warm glow spilling across the porch. The mountain was quiet again, the kind of silence that meant peace, not fear. Somewhere down in the valley, church bells rang faintly, carried by the evening breeze. Elias leaned back in his chair, the smell of wet pine thick in the air. Willow grazed nearby, the last light of day turning her coat gold. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel so empty. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the mountain wrap around him. The whisper of wind, the gentle rush of the creek, and the slow, steady breathing of the horse that had saved his life. The truth was no longer buried. The land, the man, and the animal had all found their peace. And high above, the mountain stood silent and eternal, keeping its last secret, one of forgiveness. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.